Now, the first thing we need to understand is what poverty means. Poverty is not just being a little broke before your next wages come. Poverty means not having enough money to sustain yourself and or your family between paychecks. Poverty means not having enough money to eat nutritiously. It means not having enough money to send your children to schools or to good schools. Sometimes it means not having enough money to have a place to live that you are secure in. And sometimes it means not being able to pay your bills or own a cell phone so you can have no contact with others. Sometimes it means not being able to afford a bus ticket. Poverty means to not have enough money to live what we call a dignified or normal life. Now, as to climate change, we worked with that earlier, so I won't repeat that, but climate change and poverty are inextricably linked, and I will explain how and why. So what does money have to do with it? I mean, there's the climate and there's money. Do those two have anything to do with each other? Well, the thing is that in order to affect the climate, we have burned a lot of CO2-rich fuels, fossil fuels. We have produced a lot of CO2. Why have we produced the CO2? Well, it isn't for fun. We've done it to make money. There's no one who burns coal just for the hell of it. We do it because burning the coal gives us energy to do something. And do something usually means to produce something, to make something, and that something is sold and someone earns money from it. And we have used the burning of fossil fuels to advance production, medicine, science, transportation. Our world is entirely changed because of the internal combustion engine, forbrenningsmotor. That is what is inside a car, what is inside a plane, what makes factories go round and round. The way we burn fuels to generate energy has revolutionized and changed our society. These are pictures from Oslo, actually, in the early 1920s. That is 100 years ago exactly, around 1920. These pictures were taken by a woman called Nanna Broch. She was a housing inspector for the Council of Oslo. And as you can see, this is how people lived in Norway 100 years ago. This is a little ramshackle house. It has 2, possibly 3 rooms altogether, and families were usually large. So you had a lot of children in a very small house. As you can see in the picture next to it, people do their washing by hand, and these children do not look very happy. This was Norway 100 years ago. And this is a completely regular apartment in one of the cheaper parts of town in Oslo today, 100 years later. Now, to go from this to that, major changes had to take place. And those changes inevitably polluted the earth. We have changed what we eat. The picture on the left is a picture of normal diet for a Norwegian 200 years ago. It's fish, potato, and flatbread. That's usually what we ate, and it's very energy efficient to make. It doesn't produce a lot of CO2 because the fish was fished naturally in the oceans, and the potatoes were grown on our own soil by our own people, and the flatbread was made from grains. And all of this is very energy efficient. It produces very little CO2. Now the food on the right, as you can see, is more recognizable. It's what people usually eat today. Fast food, a lot of white grains, a lot of meat, a lot of fried stuff, but meat most importantly. The abundance of food and the abundance of meat has changed radically over the last 100 years. 100 years ago, most people would not eat a lot of meat. Actually, most people's diet in Norway would consist of fish, vegetables, and occasional meat, usually in the form of cut-offs. That means the meat that the rich people were not interested in, which was sold a little cheaper from the butcher. And so you would have innards like liver and lungs and sausages and other things that were cheaper. Today, most people have access to whole cuts of fresh meat, which is very energy uh, ineffective. It costs a lot of energy and produces a lot of CO2 to produce meat. Like we saw in the documentary Before the Flood, producing meat affects the climate in a huge way. It produces so much CO2 and methane, and it takes up so many resources. If most people had cut their meat consumption in half, we would have made a serious impact. But today people eat mostly meat, and that of course has helped affect the climate. Furthermore, we have changed the way we dress. We have changed the way our houses look. We have changed how many children we have. Back in the day, people had more children, which is true. That costs more CO2. That produces more CO2. However, people owned very little compared to what we own today. Most people only had a few outfits, one set of work clothes, one set of church clothes, and possibly an extra set for winter. Today, people have cupboards and drawers and closets full of clothing, and the clothing is usually produced from materials that require a lot of energy to make. You can see the family on the left. Usually, their clothes would be made from wool, possibly cotton, sometimes more expensive fabrics, but most of the time, most fabrics were made from wool. And as we had a lot of sheep in Norway and ate the meat, we could also use the wool for clothing. Today, most of our fibers are synthetic. That means not natural, but man-made in laboratories or factories or other artificial conditions. So our clothing today is usually cost ineffective. It costs a lot of energy and resources to make them, but they are very cheap because they are produced with cheap labor in countries that have, shall we say, not quite as much focus on labor laws and labor protection. So the clothes we wear today are usually cheap and costly to make in terms of the environment, whereas the clothes we used back in the day were usually plain wool. And also, like I said, people owned less. Back in the day, there were no cell phones, there were no bikes or cars or TV sets, and the production of all these things produces a lot of CO2. Now, this is a chart from China. China has gone through the same development that Norway has. And as you can see, the percentage of the population that was poor has decreased rapidly over the years. Now, this table is a little hard to read because it says 120%, and that doesn't make sense. I don't know if that's a mistake or not, but I did check the sources, and it is true. China has gone from about 100% poverty. That means every single one living in that area was poor, was suffering poverty in 1978, and down to almost 0% in 2015. That means the number of people who did not have enough money for food or shelter is almost zero now. It used to be almost 100 in rural areas. That means in the countryside, outside of town. Now, how did they do this? How did China manage pretty much what Norway did? This was also the case in Norway. Most families in the rural areas were very poor. Norway was indeed a developing country, et u-land, before we found oil. Now, the oil made us obscenely rich. What did the Chinese do? Well, the Chinese government increased production. They started making more things. So the Chinese could go from extreme poverty levels in rural areas, that means outside of towns, as you can see in the left picture, to what we see in the right picture. The number of Chinese millionaires has now surpassed the number of American millionaires. And so we must ask ourselves, who benefits from climate change? And the easy answer is, it's us. It's the people who own the stuff we use that leads to climate change. It's Norway who owns the oil. It's the Saudi Arabian oil owners, privatized of course, not nationalized. It is China who produces all the stuff we buy on Wish or on AliExpress or other shopping sites. The people who produce what is being sold, the people who own the oil or coal or gas that is used in production, we become obscenely rich. The oil fund in Norway alone is possibly big enough to sustain our country for decades and decades after all other money and production stops. And who suffers from climate change? Well, it's the people who do not own the means of production. It's the people who do not own oil, the people who do not produce all the goods that are sold, or the people who do the actual work, like the people who work in the factories, but who don't own the factories. Because the people who own the factories get all the money, and the people who work there, not so much. So the price of that cheap sweater or that double McDonald's burger or that airplane trip to Thailand or that super shiny new phone you just got, the price of that is that some people somewhere have to make them, are paid very little, and have to live with the climate change, which increases with every purchase we make of something that is produced using oil, coal, or gas, which is today pretty much everything. So we should ask ourselves, why does everyone want what we have? Well, because we have everything. Compare a picture from downtown Oslo, on the left, with a picture from a central area in a Brazilian town in Sao Paulo. Of course, the people on the right would like to have what the people on the left have. Of course, everyone wants to lift their country out of poverty. Everyone wants to do what Norway did and what China did, to go from extreme poverty and a lot of poor people who cannot support themselves and their families, to a country where everyone has enough, where almost no poverty exists, and where almost everyone has a chance at making a good life for themselves. The thing is, if every country in the world started acting like Norway and China has, if everyone were to lift their population out of poverty the way we have, it would absolutely destroy the earth. So we can't really sit around and wait for people to do that. Now, why though is it fair that we have all this and other people don't? Is it fair? Isn't it? Should it be this way? Should we do something? These are all questions you're going to have to ask yourself. But you have to understand one thing, and that is that the reason climate change has been allowed to go on for so long is because climate change is a direct result of people improving their lives, improving the population's lives, and making a lot of progress and a lot of money.